Oh, I think we're live, so that only leaves it for me to say hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. Now, something kind of funny happened in the news lately. Kind of funny, kind of stupid, but also kind of really interesting. And it all starts from some comments that Gene Simmons made, and he's made them before, much like Groundhog Day at the beginning of February. He always pops up to talk about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and what should and what should not be in it. Now, I know that a lot of people who comment on music talk about this, and I just want to set something straight from the beginning. I do not care about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I just don't, because I don't really think that you can measure music in the same way that you measure other things like competitive sports. With competitive sports, there's a clear set of rules by which a winner and a loser is determined. Football, baseball, basketball, hockey, soccer, boxing, anything, you know that someone's gonna win, or, as the old song goes, someone's gotta win and someone's gotta lose. And it's fun and it's exciting and it's passionate and it can be disappointing if you're on the losing side, and it's great. Music is very different. You don't really win at music. Not in a specific sense. I suppose you could win in a general sense, where if you accomplish your goal of getting an audience to feel some sort of emotional connection to your music, you could call that a win. If you play music for yourself and you like it, you could call that a win also. But in the traditional sense of, oh, this person's in the Hall of Fame because he hit so many home runs, this person's in the Hall of Fame because he had the most passing yards of any quarterback. Those are objectively measurable things. Again, Super Bowl winners, Super Bowl losers, playoff winners, playoff losers, etc. And music just doesn't work that way. But things like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame have been set up, I think, very cynically to promote various record labels that are promoting various artists who want to promote a various tour or a various box set or things like that. So I think the whole thing is contrived. And when you look at the financial model of that particular institution, well, you don't need to take it from me. Listen to what Steve Miller said when he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and he tears it apart. They don't even let the artists go for free. They charge the artists to actually sit at their own award ceremony, which is a really weird and I think really unethical thing to do. So I'm not going to talk about that because, again, I don't really care. The organization exists. I think it's just another business venture disguised as something that music doesn't even need. Music doesn't need Hall of Fames. It needs performances and performance venues, as I talked about on my stream earlier. That's what it needs most of all. But anyway, it is what it is. But the actual comments that Gene Simmons made, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame notwithstanding, are actually very interesting. And this is what it boils down to. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame has a lot of acts in it that are not rock and roll by most people's definitions. It has hip hop groups, it has a couple of jazz artists. Miles Davis is in there, and Miles can kind of be rock and roll, but we'll get to that in a minute. It has folk artists, country artists, all sorts of artists that don't necessarily fit the textbook standard, rational, reasonable person's definition of what rock and roll is. And this bothers Gene Simmons. I don't really know why, but it does. And I guess so there are some people out there, and I think he might fall into this segment, that think, well, there are a lot of good acts that the majority of people would consider rock and roll that are not in this so called Hall of Fame, while there are acts that most people would not consider rock and roll, even if they like the acts in question, and yet they are in the Hall of Fame. What's the deal with that? Goes the story. And this really comes down to a question of, how do we define genres? Do we define genres by a certain musical style? Do we define genres by a certain musical era in which they took place? Or do we define a genre by how the music is consumed? Now, this final definition about defining a musical genre based on who is consuming it, this is probably the most musically inaccurate way to define a genre. Or is it? because most musicians will tell you that they don't sit down and say, I'm going to be such and such kind of musician. I'm going to be such and such style composer, or songwriter, or singer, or trumpet player, or guitar player, or drummer. They just play the kind of music they want to play. And they're not necessarily concerned about labels, certainly not at the beginning. And if you accept this as broadly true among musicians, the thing that you have to then accept from there is, well, maybe the definition of genre as defined by consumption is in fact the most accurate way to approach this. And this isn't me who invented this idea. It was none other than Frank Zappa, because Frank Zappa was once asked if he was rock and roll, and in particular if he was progressive rock. And he said, no, I'm not progressive rock, and I don't really consider myself rock music at all. However, my music is generally consumed by rock audiences. And I do think that is sort of the key. Now, in addition to Zappa's analysis, there's some other evidence that we can point to. For many, many decades, Tower Records and the other big record chains would put all sorts of music, the mainstream music of the day, in a certain part of the store, and it would be shelved under the title rock, pop, and soul. And that is a lot of genres. So let's talk about what was excluded from that. Well, jazz, things that identified as jazz, or things that were consumed by people who identified themselves as jazz consumers, those were racked in other parts of the store. So there's that. What other genres? Classical, things that were bought by people who would consider themselves classical music consumers, those were racked yet in a different part of the store. In fact, in some of the smaller Tower Records locations, just to use one big chain of yesterday as an example, sometimes the classical music was on the other side of the street from the main store. And what else? Country and Western, that was usually racked separately as well. And then when hip hop came into it, this was a big question. Some stores, when hip hop came in, changed the main area, the main racks where the records and CDs and tapes were shelved, as rock, pop, soul, and R&B, and they put hip hop under the R&B category. Sometimes stores would have their own section for hip hop and R&B, and sometimes stores that had really emphasized the rock and pop buyers more than anyone else wouldn't even shelve hip hop and R&B because they considered it so different that it should have its own specialty stores. All of this I'm talking about for reference sort of late 80s, early to mid 90s. Now, what is this grand rock, pop, soul, and occasionally R&B category? Well, these were for the these this sort of became a byword for music that sells more than the other genres. Again, much more to do with the consumption process than the process of actually writing, playing, and recording the music. Now, why was this? Well, every era since the beginning of pop music has been dominated by one or two, usually one, styles of musical language. Now, what is a musical language? Well, it has to do with the arrangements. Do we have a guitar on every song? Do we have a string section on every song? How often are trumpets present? So you notice patterns in arrangement. That is the most easy way to recognize the musical language of any particular genre. Now, what else can we identify? We can identify things like tempo. Is it syncopated? Is it swung? Is it straight? These things also give us clues as to the musical language that is underpinning this style of music. And from around the 1920s to somewhere in the early or mid 60s, the main musical language or languages that underpinned American, and by definition, by extrapolation, international pop music was jazz. And who are the biggest pop stars of, let's say, let's just take the 40s and 50s? Well, Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, Perry Como, people like Ella Fitzgerald, people like Johnny Hartman, not so famous, but yeah, famous. People like Andy Williams, people like Dean Martin. all very different musicians from comparatively different backgrounds, but most of the arrangements were somewhat jazzy. You had saxophones, you had swung rhythms on the drum set, you would have the upright bass as opposed to the electric bass guitar. You had acoustic piano as opposed to electric keyboards, at least in the 50s. All of these things, you'd have a string section. Well, strings aren't jazz. No, they're not. But the style of pop music that derived from a jazz lexicon in order to really emphasize the point that, hey, you're listening to a pop record and not a strict traditional hardcore jazz record, they put some strings on there as a signpost that while it might be jazz derived, while there might be swung rhythms, while there might be people snapping their fingers, while there might be some scat singing, the violins are there to assure you that, oh, this is a pop song, this isn't strict jazz. But all of these things combine to make pop music of the mid 20th century pretty jazzy. Now, true jazz aficionados wouldn't necessarily call this music jazz. They might call it anything but. At the time, they would have just called it popular music, popular vocal song based music. Whereas the jazz guys, or cats as they would have maybe called themselves in the 40s and 50s, would have emphasized swung rhythms, but more complex and often faster than you'd find in pop music, generally in absence of strings, although Charlie Parker did use strings as well, as did others. There would be much less of an emphasis on vocal songs and much more on instrumental compositions, where the real meat of the thing were the solos played by instruments, which also give you a signpost like saxophone, like trumpet, like acoustic piano. All of these signposts were there to delineate, oh, this smells and sounds and looks like jazz, in the same way that pop had that. Now, in the 60s, rock and roll started to come of age. It went from a musical genre that most people found expendable and most people found was a temporary flash in the pan for teenagers. By the time you get to 1965, 1966, 1967, you realize that, to coin a phrase, rock and roll is here to stay, or at least it was for the time being. Now, this had a profound influence on pop music. In terms of the next generation of songwriters, people like Jimmy Webb, people like Burt Bacharach, they started to put in many more signposts of rock into their music. And it didn't happen all at once. There were many jazzy elements of those two songwriters I mentioned, but you began to see rhythms that were more sort of driving and less swinging. You began to see things like many more layered electric keyboards, electric guitar, electric bass guitar, drums that were a bit more insistent in terms of their place in the mix. And all of these are signposts that, you're listening to pop that is derived from rock and roll. Less and less would you have the singer in a fedora while he was accompanied by a pianist. And more often than not, if you were listening to someone singing, they'd be playing the guitar, singing their own songs, which was another symptom of rock and roll. Because in the pop era that was influenced by jazz, most of the compositions were either derived from songs that or compositions rather that jazz men wrote, or that professional songwriters in Tin Pan Alley wrote, many of whom were writing them for Broadway shows, and then they were adapted to the pop world. The rock and roll musicians took a very different tact. They didn't generally rely on external songwriters. They occasionally did covers, but one of the things that differentiated rock and roll is that the bands usually wrote their own material. And the singer songwriters that emerged from the late 60s and early 70s, the key is in the name, much like rock and rollers, they wrote their own songs. Think people like Joni Mitchell, think people like James Taylor, neither of whom are really rock and roll in the traditional sense, but they formed a type of music that was in a folk tradition that became popular and therefore was pop music, that took its cues, however subtle, from the rock and roll revolution that was taking place around them. And when you look at easy listening artists of the era, when you look at artists like the Carpenters, even when you look at people like Paul Williams, a great songwriter of the 60s and 70s, their cues, again, however subtle, started to be taken less and less from the jazz world that emerged in the 1920s and more in the rock and roll world that emerged in the 60s as the dominant force in pop music. Because after all, while pop music means many things, and I explained what some of those many things were on yesterday's stream, it at the end of the day signifies popularity either by design or by happenstance. Now, what have we learned about this trend in the 21st century? Well, let's look into it. Are people writing their own songs to the extent they did in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s in the pop world? No, they are not. Are electric guitars and electric bass guitars prominent on the top sort of 10 songs on the Spotify and the Whatify and the rest of it? No, they are not. Okay, so what is? Sequencers, samplers, drum machines, synthesizers, but synthesizers used to provide a background type of drone or underscore as opposed to solo passages or as opposed to really rich and elaborate chord sequences that have a lot of variation. Now, all of this that I just described is derived from the world of hip hop. Sequencers, samplers, drum machines, synthesizers laying down an atmosphere as opposed to a strict harmonic structure. And yet, Taylor Swift isn't hip hop. Justin Bieber sometimes dresses like hip hop, but he isn't hip hop. Well, was Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin jazz? They weren't. They could get jazzy, but they weren't strictly jazz. Andy Williams, definitely not jazz, but he came of age in an era of pop music that was influenced by jazz. Likewise, remember when I said James Taylor and Joni Mitchell aren't rock in the way that Led Zeppelin is unambiguously rock? Yeah, but again, downstream of the main musical language. So, looking at things from the 1920s when radio became popular up to the present day, we really see three main musical languages that dominated the pop world. First, there was jazz and its cousin, the blues. Then there was rock and roll, and then there was hip hop. And we are still in an age where hip hop, the sounds of hip hop, the arrangements of hip hop are dominating the pop world, even though the attitude of hip hop, the lyrical complexity of hip hop, even some of the more particular musical tropes of hip hop, they're absent from Taylor Swift. You can't compare Taylor Swift to Dr. Dre. But at the same time, can you compare James Taylor to Van Halen and Led Zeppelin? Can you compare Dean Martin and Andy Williams to Sun Ra, to Pharoah Saunders, to John Coltrane? You can't, and it would be absurd to do so. But nevertheless, a certain musical language, once established, it really sets in and it begins to influence music in ways that are subtle and yet omnipresent. And so, how do we bring this all back to what Gene Simmons was complaining about regarding the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? Well, the question really is, how do we define these genres? Do we divine and that sort of goes back to where we were at the beginning. And I think that the easiest way to do it at the end of the day, unless you're going by these broad musical languages, is by how the audiences are consuming it. Now, this doesn't bode well for Gene because sometime between the 90s and the first sort of 5, 6 years of the 2000s, the audiences that were buying rock music started to buy hip hop music. As Bon Jovi went from his mid 80s peak to his mid 90s sort of nadir, the same sort of youngish kids who were buying Bon Jovi records as late as, let's say, 1991, they were now buying Ice-T and NWA and Dr. Dre and Biggie Smalls and Puff Daddy, who we're not allowed to mention anymore. That's who they were buying. It's the same kids. Their genetics didn't change. Their location didn't change. Their frame of mind didn't change. Their favorite foods didn't change. Their circle of friends probably didn't change. And yet they were listening to other forms of music. And so, what this means is that pop music audiences are really much less durable than audiences that seek out a certain style. For everyone who bought a Led Zeppelin and Van Halen record because they really liked sophisticated, hard rocking, guitar driven music, there were probably 10 times more people who bought the music because it's popular and it's nice. Why did then the successive generations transition from rock to hip hop as the 90s turned into the 2000s? Well, because they weren't out there, the majority of buyers, of music consumers. Some are, but the majority aren't saying, I will only listen to this if it has a saxophone on it and has some influence by jazz arrangements, or I'm only buying something with an electric guitar, or I'm only buying something with an electric guitar plugged into a Marshall amplifier. Anything less isn't hard rocking enough for me. These are the things that music geeks think about. These are not the things that the majority of pop music driven audiences think about. They think, it's nice. My friend turned me onto it. The radio station turned me onto it, and I like it. And they don't really give it a second thought. And this really validates the idea of Frank Zappa's statement that musical genres are defined by the people who consume them. And the people who are consuming music that was popular in the 60s, 70s, and 80s would have been generally buying rock albums because that was the dominant music form. And so when they veered off to the left and bought a Chick Corea album or bought a Frank Zappa album, yes, that stuff isn't traditional rock, but they would have been rock audiences. Likewise, if there's someone who grew up on hip hop derived music, but who enjoyed seeing Green Day at the Super Bowl, it doesn't mean that they change. It just means that a little bit of rock and roll was thrown into a musical pop culture where the audiences are generally downstream of the arrangements and the stylistic tendencies associated with a watered down form of hip hop, in the way that Andy Williams was really watered down jazz, or that the Carpenters were really watered down rock. I'm not saying watered down in an insulting way. I'm saying in the sense that it is softer on the ear, less solos involved, less musically challenging to the audience. And in the same way that your Taylor Swifts or your Bad Bunnies are downstream from hip hop, even though they're far from your hardcore hip hop. Pardon me. And so, getting back to Gene, maybe the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame should simply be called the Pop Music Hall of Fame. But the word rock and roll sounds cooler than pop, the same way hip hop sounds cooler than pop, the same way jazz might even sound cooler than pop. And yet, all of these genres, at the end of the day, except for their loyal listeners who stick with a certain style of music, most people are just following consumption trends, and therefore they follow where the styles are ubiquitous. So maybe Gene is right, but at the same time, as someone who famously rock and rolls all night and parties every day, maybe he should take some comfort in the fact that for much of his career, the musical genre that he unambiguously performed, rock music, was the dominant music that influenced all other pop music. It isn't anymore. He's lamenting that, and he's lamenting that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is chasing trends and audiences more than sticking with guitar based rock and roll. But I don't know. I think that Kiss had a good run, and I think that they are indeed one of the bands that helped push rock and roll even further into the mainstream. It's out of the mainstream now, just like jazz, but hey, what goes around comes around. Maybe one of these days you'll find pop singers embracing the sound of electric guitars, you know, bluesy but rock style chords on a Hammond organ, a driving drum beat played by a real drummer on a real drum set, and then hey, we'll be back in that world again. Sometimes what goes around comes around, sometimes it doesn't. It's just the kind of thing you'll have to wait and see. Anyway, let me know what you think, and as always, like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.